Well, hello, New Life Downtown. This is week 2 of our midweek meditation, offering 8 reflections from Romans 8. And so here we are in Romans 8, verses 5 through 9. Last week we talked about the first 4 verses of Romans, freedom from condemnation. Today we're going to talk about the flesh versus the spirit. So in verse 5, Paul writes, "Look at it like this. People whose lives are determined by human flesh focus their minds on matters to do with the flesh. But people whose lives are determined by the Spirit focus their minds on matters to do with the Spirit. So focus the mind on the flesh and you'll die. But focus it on the Spirit and you'll have life and peace. The mind focused on the flesh, you see, is hostile to God. It doesn't submit to God's law. In fact, it can't. Those who are determined by the flesh can't please God. But you are not people of the flesh, you're people of the Spirit, if indeed God's Spirit lives within you. Note that anyone who doesn't have the Spirit of the Messiah doesn't belong to him." I'm reading from the New Testament for Everyone, which is a translation done by N.T. Wright. The first question that we kind of need to grapple with here is, what is flesh? Is Paul talking about our bodies? He's saying that our bodies are incapable of pleasing God. The word flesh can be confusing because it's used in a number of different ways, but when Paul uses flesh in Romans, he's not talking about our physicality. As a good Jewish believer, he would have grown up knowing that God created this world. The physical world is not evil. He wasn't a Platonist that believed that matter or material things were evil. No, Paul's not talking about our physicality. He's talking about our mortality and carnality, if you will. The flesh that is corrupted, the flesh that is going to one day die. So it has to do with our sinful nature, and really the sinful nature that has corrupted our flesh and will lead it to death. It is, in a sense, related back to the old Eden story, where God says to Adam and Eve, if you eat of this fruit, you will surely die. Sin introduces death into this world. And so the flesh is a picture of the life that has set itself apart from and against God. The life that has set itself apart from and against God. And that's why in verse 7, Paul says, the mind focused on the flesh, you see, is hostile to God. It doesn't submit to God's law. In fact, it can't. The Common English Bible translation puts it like this. It calls it the attitude of selfishness. If you think about it, selfishness runs contrary to God's nature. God, the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is the God that is within himself self-giving love. He creates the world out of self-giving love. He redeems the world out of self-giving sacrificial love. So selfishness is the very antithesis of God's way. So the flesh is a way of living that is set against God and who He is. In a way, this whole text is about different mindsets and different results. The flesh is a mindset of independence from God. The great Saint Augustine, one of the bishops from the 4th century, described sin as being incurvatus in se. That's Latin for curving in on yourself. And later, the reformer Martin Luther would talk about sin in this way. Sin is an attempt to sort of meet your own need, but it's really curving in on yourself. Imagine for a moment trying to go to the gas station and fill up your car with gas, but instead of connecting to the gas tank or connecting to the gas pump, you bring your own hose and you run it out of your car and you run it back into your car. And you're thinking, wait a minute, that's not gonna work. How can it come out from an empty tank and back into it? There's no life, there's no flow of gasoline. And in the same way, when we are disconnected from God, we've curved in on ourselves, trying to meet our own needs. And Paul says, look, that is going to lead to death. But there's another mindset. The mindset of the Spirit actually leads to life and to peace. And when he says life, he's talking about this new resurrection, new creation kind of life. We'll talk about that next week in the next few verses. And when he talks about peace, he's talking about the idea of union with God. So if the mindset of the flesh is to be set apart from and against God, curving in on yourself, the mindset of the Spirit is union with God, peace with God, oneness with God, united with God, and sharing in His resurrection. So the flesh can't please God because it's hostile to God, but the Spirit is in union with God. And so Christians, what Paul is saying is Christians, you can now please God when you live by the Spirit. The Christian mindset, the Christian way of thinking changes. And actually, this is how renewal and transformation happens. In a few chapters in Romans 12, Paul will say, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Have a totally new way of seeing it. So here's the good news. We are people of the Spirit. You believe in Jesus, and because you believe in Jesus, that's how you know you have the Holy Spirit. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says you couldn't even confess Christ if you didn't have the Holy Spirit. So the fact that you're calling upon the name of the Lord means you have the Spirit. And the fact that you have the Spirit means you are now able to live in this new way, this way that leads to life and to peace. God bless you.